Welcome to the latest edition of the Feet to the Fire election podcast. Today, it's my favorite folks, colleagues from Chapman University, political science professor Fred Smoller, social studies professor Mike Moodian, two of the best minds on campaigns in Orange County that you'll find. It's a real pleasure to have you guys. As a reporter, we're constantly looking for academics that can tell us something, not just about Trump and the national stuff, but our local life. And I'm always saying this, that there's nobody better in the business when it comes to analyzing local races and understanding their community than you guys. You've been doing this Chapman, the survey for the last few years. It's an amazing way to kind of see how the county changes year after year. It's done with academic rigor. It's very nonpartisan. Like I said, it's one of my favorite things to sort of chew on. So again, welcome, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roberto. Thanks for the kind words.
Yeah, awesome. I figured today we do what we're all starting to get is questions from everybody about, hey, I've got the sample ballot. What about this guy? What about this person? What race should I pay attention to? So I just figured, we'd start going on just a general sort of coffee table discussion about what these races are and what we're seeing and what you guys think about the different candidates.
Sure.
Okay.
Fred, let's start with you, and let's just start on the survey.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start about the survey a little bit. That will help us just set a little bit of the general situation here about how Orange County's changed over the years. What are we looking at Orange County these days?
Well, Orange County has had this reputation, certainly nationally and even locally, that it was red county for the longest time. And in fact, we were, but that began to change in terms of the elections in 2016, when for the first time in 80 years, the county as a whole voted for the Democratic candidate, and that was Hillary Clinton, as well as the fact that even within the cities, there are only two cities, Yorba Linda and Villa Park, that have Republican majorities. So things have really changed in Orange County. We're seeing the county as a whole shifting from predominantly red to increasingly purple. And we're seeing the Democrats being able to wage very competitive races. And as you know, in 2018, all of the congressional Republicans lost.
Go ahead, Mike.
And I would just add, Roberto, Fred and I did our first survey actually in 2010, and then we had a little bit of a hiatus before we picked it up again a few years ago. And what really struck me was just that there were these major shifts and changes that had occurred in a relatively short amount of time when we did the survey in 2010 versus the time when we picked it up again 6-7 years later, in terms of views toward immigrants, in terms of Orange County's cultural diversities. Views about climate change have shifted dramatically in a short amount of time, and views about income inequality and the gap between the rich and the poor and many other areas. So we saw these changes, and we said, wow, it's certainly not, we're certainly not Berkeley. It's certainly not Blue County, but definitely a balanced county now. With people representing all spectrums. One more note about Republican majorities on councils. I know we have quite a few in South County as well, but a lot of changes that have happened in a short amount of time.
Last week when Rick Reef was here, we were talking about how the Democrats now actually outpaced Republicans in registered voters.
Yes.
And frankly, the no party preference is huge here, kind of mirroring the statewide trend, right?
Mm-hmm. Orange County's looking more and more like the state and less like the Orange County of 30 years ago. It's not your grandfather's Orange County. And I think that's becoming a great surprise for people.
Any sense from you guys on turnout, whether the impeachment stuff? I've had some friends say to me that a lot of Trump supporters, a lot of Republicans should be very motivated this time around, that there's a lot of anger about how that played out.
Yeah.
That
term is called negative partisanship, where it's not like you're for your particular views, you just hate the other side. I think it's going to be across the board. It'll gin the Democratic base as well as the Republican base. But ultimately, I think the Democrats are going to prevail. Two things that are going for Democrats in Orange County are the two Ds, demographics and Donald Trump. in our last survey, he was at 36%.
Right.
I don't think he'll go up. And with the large number of immigrants and his views on immigration and first generation people, I think it'll go down. And that fits into the second D, and that is demographics. We are just becoming increasingly diverse with Asians and Hispanics.
Now, what about turnout? Because that's always a challenge during especially primaries, and especially this one that's a new one and really a short sort of primary. How do you think that'll play?
Turnout definitely tends to be lower during primaries as opposed to general elections, and it tends to favor Republicans over Democrats. They're more likely, elderly people are more likely to vote, but yes, that's true.
Right. It's a good point. And then also, going back to our survey results, the last few years, as Fred said, Donald Trump had very low approval ratings in the county. Curious to see what the results will show us this year. Sometimes I wonder if maybe Trump over the last few years has perhaps been normalized a bit in the views of the public, and we'll see. We'll see how the results turn out this year.
So let's take some of these races. Let's start in the congressional races. What do you think will be the most interesting race to watch?
For me, it's the 45th. That's a district that Katie Porter won. It was held for decades by a Republican. John Campbell had that seat and others, Mimi Walters. That race, according to PPI, political data analysis, has a 36% Republican registration. So the Republicans have the registration edge. Katie Porter won by just 4 points. And so it's not surprising that she has several well-funded opponents who would like to take her out.
This is South Orange County. Irvine is the lead city there.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the general dynamics? Have we seen any money in that race yet?
Tons. You want to comment?
Sure, particularly on the 45th. 45th, Katie Porter has been doing very well in terms of fundraising. And Sedgwick, the Laguna Hills mayor, he's led the pack among Republicans in fundraising. But also Hong, Lisa Sparks, and Greg Raths from Mission Viejo, they've all had decent numbers, but I think that's going to be a tight race for that number 2 spot in the primary. Just because, all 4 of them have a certain amount of name ID, all of them come from elected office, but they're not county-wide, very well-known figures. We'll see. We'll see how that plays out.
I think it does. When you have an office, that gives you a built-in advantage, but it depends on the office. Laguna Hills for Don Sedgwick, it has 31,000 people. Yorba Linda is much bigger, and yet she is Deputy Attorney General. Peggy Huang is also on the city council there, larger population. But Lisa Sparks, also in the 5th district, that has the largest population of them all, about 400,000 people. All of them have raised nearly $500,000 each. So there's a real battle. Obviously, I think the incumbent will come in number 1. It's a battle for number 2, and that's really a toss-up.
Right. And, Fred had mentioned that the 45th is the most interesting to follow. I find the 39th and the 48th to be compelling races as well. The 39th because Cisneros won a razor-thin victory against Young Kim a couple of years ago.
This is up North Orange County.
Northeast Orange County, correct. And it shares some Los Angeles cities and a few other cities. But there's been a lot of money that's been pouring in for both candidates. Young Kim was up substantially election night 2 years ago, and then Cisneros, she even went to Washington for freshman congressperson training, and Cisneros day by day when the ballots were coming in inched closer before pulling out a very, very slim margin. But I think Republicans see that seat as winnable because Young Kim has been a state assembly person, has been very active in the community, so we'll see. And then also the 48th, where Harley Ruda defeated Rohrabacher 2 years ago, that still is a pretty reliable Republican district. I think a lot of that had to do with anti-Rohrabacher sentiment 2 years ago. Now Michelle Steele is running. She also is well-funded. She has a lot of the establishment behind her. She's a Trump appointee to the Asian American Advisory Committee, and she's also a county supervisor, chair of the Board of Supervisors. So I think Republicans probably see that as a vulnerable seat as well. I think they see that as a winnable seat because they don't have Rohrabacher to worry about this time.
And they also have a 7-point registration advantage, and Ruta won by just 4 points.
Right.
So it's a tight race. Again, we'll call that a competitive race along with the 45th.
Right. I think out of all the districts that are primarily in OC, Mike Levins is probably in the safest seat.
That's far South Orange County.
Far south, San Juan Capistrano. Right.
Mm-hmm.
San Juan Capistrano and San Clemente. I think Mike's running against the mayor of San Juan Capistrano is in that race against Mike. But I think he probably has the best chance out of all those.
In political science or regular politics, always look to the incumbent to do well.
Right.
Particularly when their first term, they know what they have to do. Both Katie Porter and Mike Levin have spent a lot of time communicating, nurturing the district. Now, unlike Katie Porter, Mike won by 13%, and the registration is split 33-34. So Levin is working his district. He's a smart guy. He's raised a lot of money, and so I think he's safe.
You guys will move on to assembly races?
State Senate. The Josh Newman race is definitely a rematch. Josh Newman had been removed in a recall. You have to understand, we have to always reflect that the Republicans have really lost seats in the state assembly and the state Senate. Approximately, there are some vacant seats, but there are 120 seats in the state assembly, and only 30 of them are held by Republicans. And they have 18 assemblymen. They have just 11 senators. So they need to hold on or catch up the best they can. And so the Josh Newman was someone that was targeted. The incumbent there is Ling Chang. It's considered, again, it is a race where the demographics favor the Democrats, largely Latino and Asian, about third and third each. 37%, you have a 6-point registration advantage in that district. That's the 29th, excuse me, with a 37-1. So again, a lot of money going to go into that race.
Does that straddle LA too? That's a North Orange County area, right?
Yeah,
yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
It straddles a southern part of LA. And I would add to that, Newman, I always enjoyed following because when he originally won his state Senate race, it was kind of a quirky campaign. He dressed up in a California bear costume, and he had this blimp that was flying around town. And he was the underdog. He upset, at the time, the former mayor of Irvine, who had relocated to Fullerton to run for state Senate. Right. Suki Kang. And then what happened was Republican activists saw his seat as vulnerable because they looked at the registration numbers, and they were able to launch a successful recall campaign tying him to the gas tax, which was unpopular. So this is the rematch, if you will. I mean, Ling then won based on the recall of Newman. But I agree. That's a fascinating race to watch.
And the super majority is impacted by that this time around?
They have a super majority. And so I think the Democrats are now at like 3/4. You need 2/3. But the Republicans need to hold on to every seat and to try to increase their brand. They are hurting.
Where do we go from there?
Oh, we go down to the Morlock race. John Morlock is the incumbent in the 37th district. And again, one of the things about John Morlock's seat, he's going to face either David Min or Katrina Foley. Min is the UCI professor, law professor. He had run for Congress for the Katie Porter position. And Katrina Foley is the mayor of Costa Mesa. And what we've seen is a real that used to be overwhelmingly Republican. And now the Republicans just have a 2-point advantage. And by election day, it'll probably be even. And so they've got a real race. John Morlock, of course, was on the fellow who 25 years ago called the bankruptcy, and then was on the board and as a treasurer, and now as a state senator. But again, he's got some real competition. That race is interesting to me because, again, Katrina Foley is Costa Mesa mayor. That's a city with a Democratic majority. The majority of the people on the council are Democrats, but there are 96,000 people. She's known. David Min does not currently hold a position like that. So the thing that did surprise me in the ballot statement is that Min has a very elaborate ballot statement, but Katrina Foley opted not to, for strategic reasons, to put one in there.
That's something we've started to see lately, is people avoiding the ballot statements. We were chatting a little bit about that on the break.
Right. And I would also add, Min does have some name ID because he ran for Congress in a competitive race with Katie Porter and with Brian Ford and a few others 2 years ago for the seat that Porter eventually won. The other thing that I would add there is that Min has done very well fundraising. He's raised a lot of money. I think that's a toss-up in terms of who will advance onto the general. And Morlock is very good at winning races. If you may recall, years ago when there was a special election for the state Senate, everybody got behind Don Wagner. Everybody was endorsing Don Wagner. He was outraising Morlock, and Morlock came in there, and it didn't even advance. He beat Wagner outright in the special election. Name ID, and I think there's general favorable views toward him in his district. So
he's basically held an elected position since like 1994, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Morlock will certainly get the first position. It's a question of, after the primary, who is his competitor in the fall. So it'll be Min, and I would guess Katrina Foley.
I think it's a toss-up between those two.
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, that's the fun thing about these races, is you got to run it and see who does the best job of getting out there.
It would be a huge loss for the Republicans if Morlock were defeated.
Yes, it would.
What's our next race?
Assembly.
Sure, go ahead.
Some of them I think are pretty safe. In terms of registration, Sharon Quirk-Silva is an incumbent with huge registration advantage. Tom Daley has a huge registration advantage, 51-18, Democrats to Republicans. That would be a safe seat. There are a couple of these that are competitive, but some that catch our attention, of course. One is Bill Brough, who's been in the newspaper lately for allegations by County Supervisor Lisa Bartlett of sexual assaults and expenditures, spending money to fly his pet rabbit or dog around. And he has lost their support of Fred Whitaker, the Republican Party.
He just did an op-ed basically saying did he say he should step down, or just they weren't going to back?
I thought they called for him to resign, but he's not.
Right.
And so
or not run again.
Right.
And
he lost the Republican endorsement.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the 73rd Assembly is deep South Orange County.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And
he's facing, what is it, like
Lisa
3 or 4?
Davies.
Yeah, Davies, who just got endorsed by the Register.
Just was endorsed by the Register. Which city council is she on?
Laguna Niguel.
Laguna Niguel.
Yeah.
And so she has got the GOP endorsement. So I would imagine what you will see is that in that race, which is a Republican district, which they desperately want to hold on to, and they must be extremely upset with Mr. Brough, that is a Republican seat. And so I think you're going to see Brough in there, he's an incumbent, and Davies running against each other in the fall.
Another race that I wanted to point out is the 68th, where Stephen Choi is the incumbent assembly member. When Choi won that race originally, he blew away the Democratic challenger, who wasn't very well funded at the time, by 20 points, I want to say. That's narrowed if you look at the trends. And it narrowed to a single-digit 5-6 point win 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. Narrowed to a very small. And he has a formidable opponent in Melissa Fox, the
Irvine City Council.
Who has been active and has been around for a while. So that's something we'll be keeping our eyes on as well, looking at that race.
The one that I keep hearing a lot is the 72nd Assembly race with Tyler Diep versus Janet Nguyen. I mean, that is, I'm hearing, is a knockdown, drag out. This is the future of the Republican Party, or playing out. Tyler is too friendly with public employee unions, from what I'm hearing, or that the concerns that he votes with them too much. Janet is placing herself with some of the traditional Republicans, saying that that shouldn't be the case. Tyler's maybe a new generation of assembly person, saying it's Sacramento. If you want to get something back in Orange County, you better go up there and be a little bit more cooperative with the majority.
Right.
He's looking at his registration and making the conclusion.
What are you seeing in registration?
It's 34% Democrat, 35% Republican, so tied. So he's saying, I better be more moderate, because ultimately it's not the party bosses or the Central Committee or Fred Whitaker, it's the voters who will decide whether I get to keep my job. And so it is a classic case between the ideologues. Janet Wynne is hard conservative. Fred Whitaker and the Central Committee are very conservatives. Janet Wynne is their candidate. They have pulled the endorsement of Tyler Deep because of how he's voted. He's voted on housing with the unions, with the Democrats. He's voted to support the unions, and they don't like that. And so they are supporting Janet Wynne. Again, it's a gamble. It's a gamble because they cannot afford to go down to 6 to 5 seats. This is they're throwing the dice here.
Right. And Tyler Deep was the only Republican to break ranks and vote in favor of the legislation as it relates to labor and freelancers in the state. So that was kind of the final nail in which the party turned away from him. And then Wynne, of course, longtime elected official. So yeah, that is a knockout, drag-out.
What do you guys think about the 74th Assembly there? Diane Dixon, Newport Beach Council.
It's tough.
What do you think?
Registration favors Republicans by it's essentially even when it's single digits.
Right.
She is a first term. Cotty Petrie Norris, who's that was 100 Duncan, who was in that seat. Matt Harper. For the longest time, it's a Republican district. Newport Beach, and she's got the establishment Republicans lining up against her with the mayor of Laguna Beach, of Newport Beach. So it's going to be a tough race. It's a close race.
One note, though, is that Dixon, who's the Newport Beach Council member, didn't have the strong fundraising efforts in the most recent filings that I would have expected. Most recent documents show that she's raised $350,000, so she's been significantly outraised by Cotty Petrie Norris, which will be a major factor, of course.
And Petrie Norris has worked her district.
Right.
She's a newcomer. She knows it's tough. She's been working that district, doing a lot of events. And again, incumbency helps.
And also showing that she's been able to work across the aisle with Pat Bates and
John
Morlock
and others. Yeah.
So
let's dive into two of the local races that one of them, frankly, will be over in March, which is the 3rd District Supervisor's race.
Right.
Could be over.
No, it will because there are only 2 candidates.
Two, right?
Right.
Okay. So I think it's that to me is super interesting in that it's literally like 2 months of a campaign. It's like it's boom and somebody wins, somebody loses. What do you see? What do you think?
Don Wagner versus Ashley Aiken.
Right.
I thought you meant that if Wagner went over 50%, we don't have a runoff, correct?
Right.
And so with the supervisor's race. And so that would really make it over. And that's what I think he would like to do. Otherwise, it's over in the sense that we know who his opponent will be in the fall. Aiken ran for mayor of Anaheim, was not successful. Don Wagner ran against Loretta Sanchez and got that seat in a special election. He is an incumbent. He's worked hard. He's raised money. And so, that gives him a lot of support.
Ironically, and again, for full disclosure, there are Ashley Aiken's dad, Wiley, is the chairman of the board for Voice of OC, our nonprofit news agency.
I think the more interesting race for me, that one can go here nor there because it's 33-35. Registration essentially the same. But the 1st district is interesting because Andrew Doe is a Republican. 1st district registration is tremendously an advantage to Democrats. That's Santa Ana, that's Garden Grove and Westminster. 43-24 registration. Andrew Doe has got a fight on his hand. He's going up against the former mayor of Santa Ana, Miguel Polito. Current mayor, excuse me. Okay. He's going up against Kim Nguyen.
Right.
Interesting person because you would conclude that she was Vietnamese, but she's actually of Latino descent, Kim Nguyen. And so if 1/3 of the community is Asian or Vietnamese and 1/3 is Latino, she, in a sense, has a foot in both camps. And so she could be quite formidable. First Hispanic elected to the Garden Grove City Council. And one other, who else is running?
Sergio Contreras.
Sergio Contreras.
Westminster City Council.
Yeah.
Right.
It seems like Andrew Doe is always in a tight race.
That's a hard district. I mean, as you said, the registration there is last time Doe barely made it in was it 18 the Trump year?
He was Janet Nguyen's assistant, wasn't he?
Correct. He was the chief of staff and then ran for the rest of her seat and is now coming. So he's been there for a bit.
Right. And it's funny to me because, Polito notoriously would win re-election every single cycle in
12
Santa
times,
Ana.
right.
To the point where people would call for term limits, and there were so many people who tried to unseat him. So I'm curious to see how he's going to do now as the challenger, trying to take out an incumbent.
Latinos outnumber Asians in this community, but Asians tend to turn out higher. They tend to vote by mail more, and they tend to vote Asian. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not Polito can pull that away.
As we wrap it up here, new voting systems. Do you think there'll be any surprises? Iowa got a nervous
Not
jolt.
the same. Not the same.
You don't think it'll happen? What do you think the impact will be on having longer voting, more ability to drop stuff off?
I've long been a proponent of the changes. I think Neil Kelly should be recognized for the money he's saving our community as well as the state with our new system, which consists essentially of everybody for the first time receiving a vote by mail ballot. That is new. And vote by mail essentially doesn't favor one party over the other. What it does is it increases turnout because it lowers the barriers to informed participation. I think the vote centers are an excellent compromise. Instead of 1,200 separate precincts, which barely were attended, we were up to 80% in special elections with vote by mail. Now you can go to one of about 200 vote centers, do everything there, put your ballot in. I think it's a wonderful change. And I think that they have done everything they can to make it go smoothly. And I don't think we'll see anything like what we saw in Iowa.
Right. And lowering the barrier and having access, it's only a positive thing. I think we have a very good registrar in Orange County as well. It's a very good office. So let's hope for the best. We'll be watching.
Mike Moodian, Frank Smoller, as always, a million thanks for putting in the hard work of analyzing all these races. I'm sure we'll still be in touch throughout the March primary and all the way through November.
And come to our Fighting Climate Change conference on April 1st.
Wonderful. Thanks again, guys. Stay tuned, and we'll catch you on the next podcast.